We live in the atomic age. Tomorrow's power is here, and we will live to see most of our electricity come from the atom.
While nuclear power provides an alternative to the extraction and burning of fossil fuels, the long-term problems of nuclear waste mitigate its advantages. Electric power is produced by the nuclear fission of enriched uranium rods. Fission creates heat. This, in turn, produces steam, which drives the generator that finally produces electricity. What eventually remains from this process are two kinds of radioactive waste, high-level and low-level. Low-level wastes include mostly contaminated tools and protective clothing. In the past, these were sent to out-of-state burial sites. Reactor operators are now reusing and recycling items that can be laundered, washed, and inspected to make sure there are no dangerous levels of radiation. High-level nuclear waste consists primarily of spent fuel rods from the reactor, which emit deeply penetrating gamma rays. Public concern over the potential health effects from exposed nuclear fuel was triggered by incidents that gained international attention. Depending on the degree of exposure, radiation can cause severe burns, cancer, and genetic mutations.
Spent fuel definitely is the hottest thing we have, radiologically speaking. That's why we segregate it in a steel-lined, water-filled pool under approximately 24 to 25 feet of water. Since spent fuel is so highly radioactive, it has to be handled with great care and handled at a distance and underwater because water is such a good shield for it. So what we do is we lift each bundle out individually from the reactor core. The spent fuel is grabbed remotely, picked up, moved through a movable door into the spent fuel pool, and then is placed in the appropriate rack. Spent fuel pools were never designed to be a final repository. They were always a temporary storage mode. So what we're looking for now is dry cask storage, which would be very high integrity shielded containers which you can store outside on a pad somewhere outside your plant. But the final solution is really to get a high-level waste repository.
From its start in the 1950s, commercial nuclear operators were wary of the long-term waste storage problem, but encouraged to proceed at all costs by the United States Atoms for Peace initiative.
The quid pro quo was that the government would take the residue or the spent fuel and dispose of it. That culminated with passage of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act in 1982.
The Nuclear Policy Act of 1982 directs the Department of Energy to develop a permanent repository for spent nuclear fuel and high-level wastes. Yucca Mountain, a volcanic peak 100 miles northwest of Las Vegas, has been proposed by the federal government as the site for a long-term repository for high-level commercial nuclear waste. Canisters of solid radioactive waste will be remotely lowered into a horizontal emplacement bed nearly 2 miles long, 1,000 feet below the top of the mountain and 800 feet above groundwater.
The concept is what we call defense in depth, where you have all solid material encased in specially designed canisters, emplaced in dense geology, in a closed water basin. It's a unique basin. The water table in Yucca Mountain does not go out into the ocean. It does not go into the general environment. It is closed. It's unique in all the world. You then place these canisters in a engineered environment which enhances the geology of Yucca Mountain, so that should the canisters fail over time, it is the natural geology, the rock itself, which will protect the public and the environment.
Yucca Mountain has some problems, and from everything that we know about it, it's not going to work that way. It will not isolate the waste over a very long period of time. we've discovered that water moves down through Yucca Mountain very rapidly and can contact the waste and could get the waste to the environment, meaning to water wells that people use for drinking water and irrigation in the farming community just across the way here. It could contaminate the groundwater within a matter of about 50 years, when we're looking for something for tens of thousands of years in the way of isolation of these long-lived radionuclides.
The scientific evidence supporting the intrusion of groundwater through Yucca Mountain was aided by its proximity to the Nevada test site. Chlorine-36 is an isotope that occurs naturally only in small amounts. Large amounts, however, were created by atmospheric weapons testing. When researchers checked the levels of chlorine-36 in water from the fractures, pores, and tunnels deep inside Yucca Mountain, the results were disproportionately high, meaning that in the 50 years since atomic weapons testing began, the mountain had been penetrated.
We have found minute quantities, trace quantities of chlorine-36 in the tunnel, not at the repository horizon, however. The important aspect here is that we have found them, that we know about it, and so that we can engineer around that, take advantage of any fast pathways, and make certain that any water which does penetrate the mountain travels away from the repository horizon.
In addition to concern over the permeability of Yucca Mountain, is its location in a highly seismic region. Over the past 20 years, there have been 600 earthquakes ranging from 2.5 to 5.6 on the Richter scale.
In 1992, there was a magnitude 5.6 earthquake that damaged the Department of Energy's office building there.
One of our surface buildings sustained about $40,000 in damage. There were some broken windows and some loosened plaster. And that was a building built in the 1960s to no particular standards. We will be developing any surface facilities, and certainly any underground facilities, which will be capable of protecting the material and our facilities for an earthquake of significantly greater magnitude.
They say that earthquakes are not a concern underground because you don't get as much ground shaking underground as you do on the surface. So what they're saying is they can design the underground repository so that there is not a risk of damage from earthquakes. Well, there's a couple of faults that run right through the waste emplacement area, and movement on those faults would likely damage the waste containers.
So again, we're quite confident. We're not concerned about it. We know the site is seismically active, and we're going to deal with that.
Transportation of the irradiated fuel is also a very risky business. If you look at where the reactors are in the country relative to Yucca Mountain and start tracing likely rail and highway routes, you go through 43 states over a 30-year period. And if you look at the population surrounding those transportation routes right now, it's about 50 million people. Even without accidents, you still get some exposure just by a transportation cask full of nuclear waste going by you.
Part of this total protection effort is the testing of shipping containers, casks designed to carry radioactive materials. A truck carrying a 22-ton spent fuel cask impacted a 690-ton concrete block at 60 miles per hour. The cask sustained so little damage, it was cleaned up and impacted the second time, but at 84 miles per hour. The cask also survived this more violent crash with only minor damage.
Statistically, you can expect a few accidents where you actually have a breach in the container and you will have radioactive material spread around due to either a rail or a truck accident.
The final impact test had a 74-ton shipping cask carried by a cask rail car crash into the concrete block at 81 miles per hour. This same cask and rail car were then positioned over a pool of jet fuel and subjected to an engulfing fire. Surface temperatures exceeded 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was no evidence to indicate that even the combination of the crash and fire would have released excessive amounts of radioactivity into the environment.
They've tested its safety measures, but they have never tested it to see what it would take to destroy it. And there have been accidents on the freeways that have involved explosions reaching 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, and those fires lasted up to 6 hours.
There probably are reasonably safe ways of dealing with nuclear waste, ones that would be acceptable to the skeptical scientific community, but they're not in place now, and there don't seem to be any plans for them at the moment. You've got to be very cautious with those things. I think the general public is now alerted to this, and that's why you see a lot of the NIMBY sort of syndrome, not in my backyard. You'll notice these are never going to be planted behind the mansions of the people who made all the money off of nuclear power.
The politics are that spent fuel is scary and people don't want to be around it. And further, they don't want it where it is, and they also don't want it to go anywhere else. So you're kind of caught in the crossfire of a lot of things that people don't want.
At this point in time, the commercial reactors have produced about 33,000 metric tons of irradiated fuel, the high-level nuclear waste. If they run their total licensed lifetime, they will produce about 86,000 tons. We've only created, so far, they've only created about a third of the total amount.
Some of the blame comes to us because we're perceived as an instrument of the nuclear power industry. Because if you close the nuclear fuel cycle, as a repository would do, then nuclear power becomes a viable option for generation of electricity.
The first thing that we support is on-site storage until we find a safe way of dealing with it. This nuclear waste is going to be dangerous for over 25,000 years. We don't need to rush into a bad solution. Yucca Mountain is a bad solution.
The reality is, without technical issues in the way, the safest thing would be to take the spent fuel somewhere where it could be managed in one safe location.
I can't tell you Yucca Mountain is a suitable site. I also can't tell you that it's not a suitable site. That's our job right now, is to study and make certain that we can make that determination.
The biggest message I can think of is that it's better to be active today than radioactive tomorrow. What we're allowing our government to do today is going to affect not only our generation, but all our future generations.
Sometime in 2001, the Secretary of Energy will take the results of the environmental impact statement and all our other studies and make a determination as to whether or not Yucca Mountain is a suitable site. The final decision is up to the Congress.
We're doing future generations a major disservice, and one that's also irreversible. If we create a waste situation that will go on for thousands of years just because the utilities are in a big hurry to get rid of their garbage right now. They don't want to hold on to it at their reactors because it's a liability. If it were a real safety problem, then the locations where it is right now should not be licensed in the first place. So there really are no solutions. If this problem is so intractable and we really don't know how to safely isolate the waste, then why do we keep making it?